Women have often been held to a different standard than men in society. Specifically looking at the Victorian era, women were expected to be silent, keep up their appearance, set themselves up to be doting wives, and raise a family. Any other aspirations were quashed, and any woman who didn't fit in was seen as potentially mentally ill. Even with these restrictions, many women found their way into workplaces and other realms of society, typically deemed men only. As the 19th century was drawing to a close, the calls for equal rights and equal treatment were growing louder, and despite pushback, things like voting rights for women were only a couple of decades away. But it wasn't just voting and working where women weren't seen as equals. It was also understood that women weren't as inclined as men to commit crimes. There was the occasional crime of passion and a few women murderers, but these were seen as nothing more than sporadic events. Violent crimes aside, financial crimes like embezzlement were something that no woman could ever do. At least that was the mindset of many in 1897, when a woman in Boston would make headlines like no one had ever seen. Welcome to Season 2 of The Long Way Home. I'm your host, Josh Bearhard Hawk. In this episode, we're digging into a story lost to time. It's a tale you won't find anywhere else, and it's one that caught my eye for the mystery and intrigue usually found only in the pages of novels. So buckle your seatbelt and lean back as we take a drive down dusty back roads and open freeways. The destination isn't really important, it's all about the journey, and the journey is so much better when you take the long way home. If I bring up famous financial crimes, you might think of names like Bernie Madoff or Enron. Usually, these kind of crimes are perpetrated by wealthy men, conning their way through life and stealing millions of dollars from hardworking individuals around the world. They often own luxury yachts and fly around the globe in private jets. We could go on for hours about the financial system in the United States, talking about how it doesn't work for the working class or how so many have lost millions in the stock market, but today we're focused on one story from the late 1800s. Markets back then were unregulated, and the financial system in general wasn't nearly as global as it is today. By 1897, the Gilded Age was in full swing. This was a time of massive growth, at least for the wealthiest among us. Names like J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and Andrew Carnegie became well known in the era, building legacies on the backs of workers that last even to this day. While the wealthy thrived, however, the working class suffered more than at any other time in American history. An economic shift from agriculture to industry was taking place, and many lost their jobs and homes as workers flocked to cities in a desperate attempt to make a living. As the wealth gap grew, many yearned for a better life, chasing the promise of riches into bucket shops. Bucket shops were essentially places where people could go to place bets on the stock market. Rather than buying individual stocks, people would place a bet on whether a stock would rise or fall. They were, for all intents, casinos operating based on the stock market. It is at one of these bucket shops on Water Street in Boston, Massachusetts, where we meet a lovely young woman by the name of Alice Barrett. Miss Barrett recently came into some money, about $1,000 left to her by her late father, and is seeking the chance to make that sum of money into a much higher amount. Though she received it in April, she didn't pull any out until October, finally withdrawing $800 to spend on some nice clothes and a little jewelry. Alice works for the real estate firm of Codman & Codman in Boston. She's been working there since shortly after graduating high school, and William Codman, one of the owners, has come to trust her implicitly. She mainly works as a stenographer, but she's also recently been asked to take care of the finances for the business as well. It's this last thing that she's thinking about as she stands in the bucket shop with a small amount in winnings from what was left over of the $800. Working for Mr. Codman, she's come into contact with several wealthy individuals, and she can't help but imagine joining them in their travels around the world, living extravagantly and joining social circles full of beautiful people. But the small amount she has left from her inheritance won't be enough to get her there. She's going to need much more. More than her $8 a week salary can get her. It is there in that smoky room, surrounded by gamblers, that she decides to make the life that she wants a reality. Over the next few months, she would begin systematically taking money from Codman and Codman. Removing small amounts from the business accounts, she would cover her tracks by adjusting the company's books ever so slightly. Mr. Codman accepted the numbers she was providing without question, and by the time anyone would notice, she would have made back enough from speculating at the bucket shops to pay it back. That was the plan, at least. As time went on, however, her luck turned sideways, and she started losing more and more. Telling herself she was due for a win, she kept betting and sinking more into the hole. By the summer of 1897, she found herself nearly $3,000 in the red. She was sure that, given enough time, she could eventually make back the money. But time wasn't on her side. It was a warm day in July of 1897, and Alice found herself making small talk with one of the firm's managers, Mr. Briggs. He was technically her boss, though she really only answered to Mr. Codman. As they conversed, Mr. Briggs would unintentionally set in motion a chain of events with one utterance. "You know, William Codman is getting on in years, and his brother John isn't doing too well either. I think it will only be a matter of time before they sell the firm." Alice's heart dropped to her stomach. If the firm were to be sold, the books would need to be audited. If someone from outside looked into the numbers, they would discover her accounting was off. Hiding her panic in the moment, she would start working on a plan. She'd been losing a lot of money on speculation. She needed another way to make back enough to cover her tracks. Desperately, she searched for a solution over the next few days, but nothing seemed to be ideal. By the end of the week, she found herself running errands for a client and making a last-ditch effort at raising at least some of the money she needed through a loan. But even borrowing the money proved impossible, and as she rode around town in a carriage on Friday afternoon, a new plan was starting to unfold. She'd completed the errands that she needed to run, and the carriage driver asked if there was anywhere else she needed to go. Hesitating for only a moment, she asked him to take her to the hardware store, Lovell's, and see if it was open. It turned out the store was still taking business, and Alice would wind up buying a dog collar before making her final purchase for the day, a .32 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver. The rest of Friday evening would find her at her mother's house before finally heading home for the night. The next morning, she spent some time in town with a friend before heading to work. She only spent a couple of hours in the office, leaving a little after 1, but she didn't go home. Waiting nearby, she watched as Mr. Briggs locked up around 2 p.m., letting herself back in after he'd gone home. She couldn't let anyone find out what had happened, and there was only one solution. Gathering together several company documents as kindling, she started a fire in the washroom, placing the financial book on top of the blaze. She locked the washroom door and made her way to the safe. She could make it look like she'd been robbed again, like a thief had made away with the money. She'd even made a point of telling her friend, Miss Meehan, that very morning about the robbery from a year prior, planting the seed for what would come next. To cover her tracks further, she'd written a note and shoved it neatly into her pocket. It detailed how she'd loaned out $800, most of her inheritance, to an unnamed associate, and how that person was now unable to repay the money. She added that no one should go looking for that person, correctly assuming that individual would be the prime suspect in her murder. Standing in front of the safe, she closed her eyes and pointed the revolver she'd purchased less than 24 hours prior at her chest. Taking a deep breath, she pulled the trigger. The sound of the bullet exiting the chamber was drowned out by a clap of thunder that happened at that very moment. A storm had been raging in the moments before she lit the fire, and a flash of lightning was the last thing she saw before everything went dark. Nearby, the janitor for the building, Mr. Hamilton, saw the lightning strike as well. But the lightning wasn't his main concern, as he'd noticed smoke billowing from one of the windows. Making his way up the stairs, he opened the door of the office to find Alice Barrett laying motionless on the floor. Smoke was beginning to fill the room, and he had to retreat to call the fire department before doing anything else. The next couple of hours would see her body moved as the fire was put out. It was thought at first that the lightning strike had killed her and set the fire, but the investigation that followed would unravel the whole story. Are you enjoying The Long Way Home? If you like these true tales of love and loss, you're going to enjoy my books. For those who don't know, I'm also an author of fictional works covering horror and mystery. My debut novel, The Journal, released in 2023, and follows the story of a man named Josh who works to uncover the mystery of what happened to a private detective named Heath in the 1960s. As the story unfolds, Josh finds himself in a mystery of his own as he realizes he hasn't had contact with anyone in days, except some strange entity that seems to be trying to send him a message. I won't spoil the ending, but you'll find there's much more to the story than meets the eye. Legends and Tales, creepy and fun stories to tell around the campfire, is a compilation of short horror stories, both true and fictional, all written by me and released in the fall of 2023. It's perfect for those nights around the campfire and includes tales like An Unwelcome Guest, where a detective meets a demon who wants to take him for a ride. It also has several stories ripped straight from Ohio legends, like One More Ride, a new twist on the tale of the headless motorcyclist out of Elmore, Ohio. GPS Signal Lost came out in early 2024, and it follows the tale of Charlie Wood. Charlie was mostly an average guy with a soon-to-be ex, wife, and kids who barely noticed how often he wasn't home. Spending his time trucking across the United States, he longed for a different life. A bathroom break in New Mexico would jumpstart that new life when he emerged from taking a dump to find the world void of life. Or at least it seemed to be. Before long, he found himself in the company of a mannequin named Lisa, a stuffed dinosaur named Kyle, and a creepy statue of Bigfoot called Steven. It was all weird enough to start, but when his new friends start taking on a life of their own, it gets even weirder. All three of my books can be found on Amazon or my website, joshbearhartlegendsandtales.com, and they're just waiting for you to get lost in their unique worlds. But that's enough about me. Let's get back to the dirt road we were traveling down. When I was researching this story, the first inkling of it came in the form of a quick blurb in the July 25th, 1897 edition of the Boston Globe. It read, Miss Alice M. Barrett, a young and pretty typewriter, killed by lightning in an office at 40 Kilby Street. At the time, I saved the article and moved on, forgetting about it for about a year and a half. I thought it would be an interesting story to cover at some point, but I never imagined what would unfold as I dug deeper. Investigations in the 19th and early 20th century were conducted by what was known as a coroner's inquest. When most people today hear the word coroner, they probably think of the person who autopsies the bodies on CSI or other forensic-type shows. But the word actually goes back to medieval England. The king, or crown, would appoint an official, known as a coroner, to establish an inquest into the manner or cause of death for individuals. In the United States, the system would carry on with coroners, or those acting in that role, being responsible for investigations into tragedies large and small. A coroner's inquest had the power to bring in anyone they needed for testimony to establish what happened in a given situation, and they would even issue a full written report in most circumstances. In the case of Alice Barrett, a coroner's inquest took shape within a couple of days, and they moved very fast. I love to read as much of the testimony from these old reports as possible, though many times the best way to get the information is from newspapers that would report on the inquests as they happened. Just a couple of days after Miss Barrett died, they'd already tracked down several people and spent hours interviewing witnesses. From the July 27, 1897 edition of the Boston Globe, we can find the following article detailing the testimony of several people. Kilby Street Fire Investigation. Testimony of witnesses appearing before Marshal Whitcomb this morning. Story of Janitor Hamilton. Fire Marshal Whitcomb began this morning his investigation into the Kilby Street fire. The fire occurred in the building where Miss Barrett came to her end. Much that was told the Marshal this morning is but repetition of what has already been told in the Globe. The investigation was secret. Only one witness was allowed in the Marshal's room at a time. The Marshal had before him today A. M. Hamilton, janitor of the building, Superintendent Abbott of the Protective Department, A. H. Ridlin, clerk of the Lovell Arms Company, where Miss Barrett bought the revolver, and a carriage driver whose name is withheld at the request of the fire marshal. District Chief Hussey was also interviewed by Marshal Whitcomb. The most detailed story was told by the carriage driver above referred to. His story was as follows. About 4 o'clock, I was hailed by a young lady on State Street. She asked me if I charged $1 an hour. I told her that I did. Then she said, "Take me up to," I forget now just where it was, but it was someplace on Bromfield Street. After leaving that place, I took her to Stoll's. Here she bought several things, for when she came back she had little white boxes, such as one gets with purchases in jewelry stores. Then she told me to drive to Hovey's. The way to Hovey's was blocked, so she said that we should go to Stearns. She stayed in Stearns perhaps half an hour. The young lady then told me to drive to the Union Station. Before starting for the station, she said to me, "I wonder if the cutlery and hardware stores are closed yet." I replied that I thought they were. We drove along, but found Lovell's open. She went into the Washington Street entrance. Was there perhaps 20 minutes. We reached the station at 5:25. She asked me how much the fare was, and I said $1.50. She gave me a $2 bill and said that's all right. The marshal asked the witness if the lady seemed despondent. Despondent? No, she seemed entirely pleasant and was a perfect lady, was the witness's answer. The first witness called in by the marshal was Janitor Hamilton. After telling his occupation and his length of service, he recited to the marshal the story which has appeared relative to the stealing of money by a laborer from Miss Barrett. This theft has been urged as a reason for the purchase of a revolver by the young lady. But the witness told the marshal that the incident occurred over a year ago. "I was downstairs," said the witness, "and suddenly I heard Miss Barrett calling to me. This was in relation to the alleged robbery. She said, 'Oh, Mr. Hamilton, a man has just stolen my money.' As I remember, she said she had lost $14. She said that a man dressed like a laborer had come in and made some inquiries relative to Mr. Codman. She was counting over some money. The telephone rang and she went to answer. Then it was that the laborer stole the money. Miss Barrett was afterward asked who it was that telephoned, but she said that no one answered when she went to it on that occasion. Mr. Hamilton said that after the incident, he had suggested to Miss Barrett that she keep the door locked when she was alone, and she always kept it locked since that time," he added. Superintendent Abbott, the next witness, told the marshal of the finding of the bag, the letter, the revolver, and the cartridges. Nothing of special interest was deduced from this witness. Clerk Ridlin of the Lovell Arms Company was called. He said, "The young lady came into the store Friday evening. The first question she asked was in relation to the purchase of a dog collar. I showed her some, but she said she wanted a better quality. I at last sold her one for 85 cents. After this, she wanted to see a revolver. I asked her if it was for protection or target practice. She replied target practice. I showed her several, but again she wanted something better. I then handed her a Smith & Wesson .32 caliber. She said she wanted something sure and accurate. I told her that was the pistol she wanted. She took it. Then she asked me how to load it, and I showed her. Then she said, 'How do you clean it?' I showed her that also. Then she told me her uncle had given her a gun for target practice. It was too heavy. Could she not change it? I said certainly, and she said she would come in a few days." District Chief Hussey, when called by the marshal, told the latter that he had sent a man to the roof. The man reported that the skylight was not broken. The inference was that if the building had really been struck by lightning, the skylight would have been broken. The marshal will continue the investigation tomorrow morning. He could not resume it this afternoon on account of the funeral of Miss Barrett and the consequent absence of witnesses. Now, it should be noted that newspapers back then, much like the newspaper companies today, tended to sensationalize stories and share only those details that made for a compelling read. Often, readers would find themselves following a story, especially one like this with so much intrigue, for days or weeks over several articles. Newspapers also tended to run with stories very reminiscent of how true crime shows and podcasts work today, leaning into whatever narrative they felt sold the best. As an example, Miss Barrett was very good friends with a man named W.H. Foss, who was reported in several papers to have been her former fiancé. The Boston Globe actually interviewed Mr. Foss, and he did his best to dispel the inaccurate reportings in the paper on July 26, 1897. "We're good friends, that was all. W.H. Foss denies the rumor that he and Miss Barrett were engaged. Scout's idea of suicide. W.H. Foss of Foss Brothers Embroidery Stampers, 2 Hamilton Place, this city, was reported to have been engaged to Miss Alice M. Barrett, who was found dead in the office of Codman and Codman, and rumor had it that the engagement had been broken. He denies this and declares that statements have been attributed to him that he never uttered. Mr. Foss was seen at his place of business this noon. His eyes were suffused with moisture. He was averse to talking, fearing that he might be misrepresented, and feeling that he could not assist in clearing up the mystery. Finally, he said, "I have known Miss Barrett for 3 years, and have called at her house sometimes as often as 2 or 3 times a week. Occasionally, I have met her at lunch here in the city, not by prearrangement, but because we dined in the same place. We were good friends." Asked if there had been any tiff or slight disagreement, he replied that there had been nothing more than a word or two of importance as affecting this case. Mr. Foss said it was true that he met Miss Barrett at a restaurant last Monday, and received a letter from her last Wednesday. "I was not engaged to her," he added at the close of the interview. "She was a girl of lovely character, against whom nothing derogatory could be mentioned. I do not believe that she committed suicide, for she was of cheery disposition and saw the beauty in life." One more question. Did he know anything concerning the $800 mentioned in the note left by Miss Barrett? Mr. Foss stated that he knew absolutely nothing about the money. From Waltham comes the news that Mr. Foss, having been a frequent caller upon the young woman at her home, at times taking her out to ride, has not been seen by the neighbors coming and going for the past month. Mr. Foss would gladly do anything to solve the mystery of the death amid the storm, but he avers that he possesses no information which would shed any light or establish any clues. That's why I'm always careful when researching these old stories. Just like today, people back then would run with whatever they thought worked for the narrative. Even after that story, papers all over called Mr. Foss the fiancé or former fiancé of Miss Barrett. But that's also why things like the coroner's inquest were so important. They usually worked to attain the facts about a case, with those compelled to testify providing what detail they could and the coroner piecing it all together like a puzzle. They weren't perfect by any means, but it is through a combination of reporting in the papers and the facts brought about by the inquest that this story can still be told over 125 years after the fact. Even given all the facts and using them to paint as clear a picture as possible, there's still a chance that Alice didn't intentionally fire the gun. Perhaps she was just placing it in the safe, not paying attention to where it was pointing, and managed to pull the trigger by accident. Maybe a loud crack of thunder caused her to jump, causing the gun to go off. And that's the thing about stories like this one. There's never going to be a way to definitively prove with absolute certainty that she meant to do harm to herself. The evidence we have, from records and the testimony of her friends, family, and coworkers, seems to point to a young woman who had dug herself so deep into trouble that there seemed to be only one way out. I try to put myself in the shoes of those involved in the stories I'm covering, to tell their story in a way that shows that they were real people, who lived real lives and who mattered to those that knew them. Sometimes it's easier said than done, but it wasn't that hard for this one. We've all faced those times in our lives where it seems like nothing is going our way. Maybe we made a bad decision or had something happen to us beyond our control. It's not hard to imagine being young and desperate to make something for yourself and then getting in over your head because of one stupid choice. While I might not be able to say with complete certainty what happened in Alice's final moments, I can say that I understand how she must have been feeling. As Season 2 of The Long Way Home rolls on, I'm going to be sharing a lot of stuff like this, going in depth on tales that I share over on YouTube. Over there on my channel, Legends and Tales, I share stories like this one from all over the United States. It's something I've been doing for a few years now, among other projects, and I'm excited to grow it as I move through 2025 and beyond. This podcast is going to be an extension of that series, diving deeper into stories and tales and sharing stuff that just doesn't fit into the video format. Subscribing on YouTube will bring both Legends and Tales and The Long Way Home to your feed whenever new episodes drop, and The Long Way Home on its own is available wherever you prefer to listen to podcasts. Some of the upcoming episodes here on The Long Way Home will be tied to older episodes of Legends and Tales, but newer stuff will be coming as well over the course of the season. As always, make sure to follow and rate The Long Way Home, no matter where you choose to listen. You can check out my books on Amazon or at joshbearhartlegendsandtales.com, and even send me a message on select podcasting platforms. I want to thank you all for joining me on this drive. Remember, the destination isn't as important as the journey, and the journey is always better when you take the long way home.